Hello, everybody, and you are very welcome to the Work Equal Conference 2020. That's me looking like Arthur Scargill, and this is the second Work Equal Conference. We're absolutely delighted to be brought to you today by our sponsors, Permanent TSB and SOLAS, who are long-term supporters of Work Equal and who have both committed to 3 years sponsorship of this event. And they are very progressive companies. We're delighted to work deeply with them on their own journey towards gender equality. The Work Equal Conference grew out of the Work Equal campaign, which is now in its 5th year. When we started to work on this campaign with Dress for Success Dublin, we were whispering in a very large room and nobody was listening. Right now, we can palpably see the change in the discourse, in the conversation. This is such a big topic. I suppose magnified now by COVID and the effects of COVID on women's position in the workplace and in our economy and in our society. This is the Solution Series, and we are in session 2 of the Solution Series. Our next event is on Thursday, and we have 2 more events then after this. And today is all about the gender pay gap. It's such a hot topic. It is divisive, but it is real, and I firmly believe that it is a symptom rather than a cause of the situation we find ourselves in. We're in very muddy waters in terms of how we measure this and how we respond to the very real issue of the gender pay gap into the future as Ireland. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that Senator Ivana Bacik is chairing today's discussion, and she was the first person to bring the gender pay gap reporting bill to the House. So delighted to have her, and she's obviously a great friend of Work Equal and we of her. So this is about raising awareness of workplace gender inequalities and related issues, and to develop solutions. And really that's at the core of everything that Work Equal stands for. We know what the problems are. We know what the inequities are. Our purpose is to posit solutions. And in today's event, we have a very, very lively contingent of multi-stakeholder groups and everybody who has a reason to be part of this discussion. And that's really important to us and to the efficiency and effectiveness of this campaign, is that we are a really inclusive, representative group who can move this issue forward. So we were established in 2016, and Work Equal is really a month of activities. And today, kind of ignobly, is Gender Pay Gap Day, where we come in at 14.4% pay gap between men and women in Ireland, which means that women effectively start working for free. And really part of our campaign is to throw a bit of understanding around that whole area, because it is still very misunderstood with the wider public. As I said, our sponsors, Permanent TSB and SOLAS, we're absolutely delighted to have them on board, and they have been huge and active supporters, as I said. So today we're going to look at the recommendations that came out of last year's conference. And much like this year with the multi-stakeholder groups, that's exactly what we did. We brought people into a room and we asked everybody to contribute to the Work Equal report, which you will see the link to download it in the chat. Really worth having a look. Many of you, I'm sure, were at the conference last year, but the fullness of the findings and the recommendations are there for you to see. But today, I suppose, looking at the recommendations that came out around the gender pay gap issue, it'll be no surprise that we want to get this up and running. We want to be part of understanding the perfect methodology for us, taking learnings from international countries who've already done this, and some of them have made mistakes. We can learn from those mistakes and have a really, really good methodology to build awareness around, as I said, an understanding of what the pay gap is and why it matters, and clear action plans from companies, because this can't just be based on words. Progress isn't about words, it's about actions, it's about a sound strategy and an associated action plan. And that's one of the things that we're going to call for when mandatory reporting comes in, that you know, a press release about how you feel about moving towards equality is not enough. We want a granular action plan so that we can track changes and track progress. And I suppose at a personal level, as individuals, all of us, to try and understand the salary landscape and get comfortable with negotiating. And that's a really big one, particularly for women. Every day I have conversations with women, really strong, powerful, intelligent women who still struggle to assert themselves in their position. So I would like you to really enjoy today's event. We are trending on Twitter, so please get onto your various social media platforms and hashtag work equal, and help to spread the message of what we're doing today. There will be an available recording on the website afterwards, and to that end we are recording today, so if you're on the Mitch, keep your camera off. And with that, over to you, Ivana.
Thank you very much, Sonja, and thank you for the kind introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay and the sound is fine. You're all very welcome to this second seminar, and I'm delighted to be working with the Work Equal campaign. It's been my pleasure to work with the campaign for some time now, and tribute to Sonja for your visionary work in getting this off the ground and really getting so much attention for it, because it is a crucial issue. Gender equality generally in the workplace, but in particular gender pay inequality. And I hesitate to say we're celebrating Gender Pay Day today. In fact, this is a cause of commiseration for all of us, since today is the day that women start to work for free effectively in Ireland due to our gender pay gap relative to men of 14%, as Sonja has said. So what can we do to address this? We're going to be discussing that today on this great panel, and I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in turn, along with Professor Michelle Miller of NUI Galway, who's the conference rapporteur for this series of workshops. And I am going to give everyone 5 minutes each just to speak on why understanding the gender pay gap is key to gender equality at work. Just to say a few things about my own work on this. As Sonja said, I introduced legislation in 2017 in the Seanad, which passed all stages in the Seanad and indeed is now before the Dáil at committee stage. It's already passed the first stage in the Dáil, and this legislation would require all companies and organisations over a certain size of 50 employees to publish data on the gender pay gap, and it would enable action plans to be provided, as Sonja has said. And we've learned from other jurisdictions which have brought in similar legislation, which is seen as very successful in tackling the gender pay gap. Clearly, we need to do something, because otherwise this is just stagnated. We haven't seen any progress on this. Unfortunately, the legislation is still languishing before the Dáil, and we're hopeful to try and get further progress on it, or indeed to push the government into bringing forward their own legislation swiftly in the term of this Oireachtas. As Sonja has said, we would like you to participate as much as possible. We're grateful to you all for coming along, and thank you for using the hashtag WorkEqual and for making this trend on Twitter. Big welcome to all of our attendees, including, I know there's people here from the media, including RTE, and also other Oireachtas members present, including Senator Annie Hoey, and I know Senator Emer Curry and Deputy Jennifer Carroll McNeil are to join us. And I want to give a special welcome also to Shane Dempsey, the chair of the board of Dress for Success Dublin, and to thank you for all your support for the organisation. So I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in turn and then ask them each to give you just speak for 5 minutes. First, we're going to hear from Laura Jones, and we're delighted to have you with us, Laura. Laura is Research Associate at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership in London, where she works across a range of social policy areas with a focus on gender equality, and she has done research recently for the UK Government Equalities Office into barriers to women's progression in the workplace. So that's going to be hugely interesting. Secondly, we will hear from Andrew Brownlee, who is the CEO at SOLAS, one of the sponsors of the Work Equal campaign, and thanks to Andrew and SOLAS for that. SOLAS is, of course, the national state agency for further education, training and apprenticeships, and Andrew has played a key role in SOLAS in putting in place a strategic performance framework, having joined SOLAS from the Higher Education Authority. So you're very welcome, Andrew. We will then be hearing from Iceland, and we're delighted to have Sonja, another Sonja with us, Sonja Thorbergsdottir, and apologies for my pronunciation of your surname, Sonja. Sonja was elected chairwoman of BSRB, which is the Icelandic Federation of State and Municipal Employees, just 2 years ago in 2018, and before that worked as a lawyer for BSRB with a focus on gender equality. And she has worked in the organisation with various actors on different projects related to gender equality, including Me Too and maternity leave, among other things. We'll be fascinated to hear the Icelandic perspective. We will then hear finally from Emma Kerins, our fourth panellist, who has worked with Chambers Ireland since 2014 and was appointed Head of Policy and Public Affairs in 2018. Prior to that, she was a political assistant with us in the Oireachtas, not with me, but in the Oireachtas generally, and a project coordinator with the National Women's Council in New Zealand. So she has a good deal of experience from abroad as well as in Ireland. And we're also delighted to have Professor Michelle Miller with us, who, as I've said, is the rapporteur for key events run by Work Equal and was co-author of last year's conference report, which you've heard about from Sonja. So our panelists are all very welcome. Just the first panelist, Laura, is going to have a PowerPoint presentation. The others will not. Could I ask attendees just to mute your mics while the panel discussion is underway? But we are welcoming comments and questions for the panel through the chat function on Zoom, and we'll come to that after the presentations from each panelist. So I'm going to invite Laura now to give us 5 minutes on the gender pay gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. Yes, I'm very pleased to be here today. So at the Institute, we recently published a joint report with the Fawcett Society and the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which mapped international gender pay gap legislation. And for us, we felt it was a really good time in the UK to take stock as we near the end of Britain's transition process and enter a period of uncertainty. But I think the findings of the report are also really useful for a country like Ireland, which is yet to enact any gender pay gap legislation, which is why I want to give you a really quick whistle-stop tour of some of our key findings today. So the report covered 10 jurisdictions, including the UK, with some form of gender pay gap legislation. And I won't take you through what the requirements are for each country, but what I want to highlight are some of the key themes that arose when we looked at the type of legislation that you see comparatively. And I want to highlight two key areas where the UK seemed to be out of step, 2 areas where it was leading, and an area of opportunity. But first, for those of us who don't know, a really quick reminder of the UK gender pay gap legislation. It was introduced in 2017, although public sector duties in some nations do predate this, and the requirement to report was temporarily suspended this year due to the coronavirus crisis. The legislation broadly applies to employers with at least 250 employees, and they must provide 4 key pieces of information, including the overall gender pay gap, the proportion of women and men in each of 4 pay bands, information on bonuses, and the proportion of male and female employees who receive a bonus. So moving on now to the results from the comparative analysis, it seemed there were 2 key areas where the UK seemed to be slightly out of step with their international peers. So firstly, when we look across the piece, we find that this 250 employee threshold is actually quite high when considered internationally. So for example, in Sweden, we see legislation applies to employers with 10 or more employees, and the median employer size is about 50. Of the countries we looked at, only Germany had a higher threshold. Looking at the content of the reports, what kind of information must employers provide? There are broadly 2 different types of information. Firstly, data on the remuneration and level of employees by gender. Now, I can say a bit more about that later on, but where I want to really focus is on the information on workforce policies and action plans. Under the UK legislation, there's no requirement for private sector employers to provide any information on the policies and steps they're going to take to improve gender equality or to produce a corrective action plan in response to any of their findings. There is that option and some employers take it, but it's not mandatory. However, in the majority of places we looked at, this is a requirement. So in Australia, for example, employers must provide information on the availability and use of a range of different policies, including those relating to retention, flexible working, parental leave, etc. In many parts of Europe, it's also a requirement to report on progress towards or assessment of the impact of those steps. In other jurisdictions, the requirement to produce an action plan is triggered under certain circumstances. And in this case, in many cases, trade unions or other employee representative groups will play a key role in determining the content of this action plan. So in France, for example, the failure to gain a certain score against a set of gender pay gap related indicators triggers the requirement to include an action plan on the agenda for mandatory negotiation with trade unions. I want to just end quickly by pointing out two areas where the UK does actually do really, really well. The first is in terms of compliance. So 100% of eligible employers reported in 2019, although that's down this year with the requirement to report dropped. This contrasts with really mixed compliance rates in other jurisdictions, as low as 25% in Germany. So we can see that it is possible for this to go well or not. And finally, the other key difference between countries is how transparent the data that is produced under the legislation is. So in the UK, all of the reports are made publicly available, produced a lot of media attention, focused on individual companies. In Australia, the information is available, the pay information is available only at an aggregated industry level. And then on the other side of the coin, you have jurisdictions where the information that is produced is internal internal company documents, and there are penalties for sharing them more widely. So just to wrap up really quickly, two areas where the UK seems to be out of step and where it's leading. We also noticed there was an area of opportunity for the UK to lead the world in terms of the plans for ethnicity pay gap reporting that they have recently consulted on. So I'll leave it there and then.
Stop tour, but there was a huge amount of information there, so we're really grateful to you. That's most helpful, and we'll come back to some of those points later, I know. I'm going to ask Andrew Brownlee from SOLAS to speak next. Andrew.
Thanks very much, and absolute pleasure to be here this morning, and also a pleasure to be continuing to support the Work Equal campaign as SOLAS, because I think it's a really important issue that we need to address. I suppose on the sorry, and if you're wondering why I was distracted there, this is one of the downfalls of doing these virtual things, as calls come in elsewhere. But anyway, sorry, we can start now. So yeah, I suppose on the surface, you would say, I kind of got the impression that SOLAS would perform well in terms of gender equality. I mean, 50% of our board is female, 50% of our senior leadership team is also female, 59% of our staff of just over 200 people is female. So I suppose when we started to think about the gender pay gap and starting to analyse how we did in that, we kind of thought that we'd be doing okay, you know, especially as we're in the public sector, you know, where you have kind of gender neutral pay scales and increments, and where you don't have that kind of intangible kind of negotiation process where there's research that maybe men are a bit more proactive and robust in terms of arguing for higher salary levels. So we don't have any of that to deal with. So we kind of expected that we come out of it quite well. But when we did the analysis of the situation with regard to gender pay in SOLAS, we actually came out with findings that are pretty similar to the overall national picture. 13% average pay gap and a 4% median pay gap. So quite a significant difference. So obviously that kind of provoked us to start to dig into why that's the case. And you know, when we started to look at it, when below director level, below that senior leadership team level, there was kind of more of a balance towards male kind of managers and male kind of predominance at that kind of middle to senior management level. And even at senior leadership team level, even though there was a kind of fair balance, we also found that the majority of females on that team had actually been recruited externally, whereas the opposite was the case for the males in the senior leadership team. Many of them had been there for in excess of 10 years and kind of had been promoted through the internal structures. So we started to wonder whether there were blockages in our internal career pathways within SOLAS. And when we looked into that, we started to see a few things that maybe suggested why we were having issues. First of all, when we got to managerial level, all of the positions tended to be advertised as fully full-time positions, 5 days a week, full-time hours. There was also very little mention of any scope for flexible working when we recruited for those kind of more senior level positions. And then when we looked a bit deeper, we also found that the vast majority of those availing of kind of reduced working hours, part-time hours, career breaks were predominantly women. And so that kind of suggested that, you know, that there was an issue in terms of helping people to progress along a real kind of career pathway and development pathway within SOLAS. Another interesting finding was we also had single gender teams dotted about the place, which obviously can't be healthy in any kind of environment. So look, we kind of had the sense that, okay, well, maybe there is a problem in SOLAS that we do need to address. And so some of the solutions, some of the things that we've done to try and help to address that, we now have a kind of robust annual staff survey. So that helps us with the evidence base, helps us to understand how people are feeling about the way in which they can develop and enhance their careers in SOLAS. And that's really important to build that kind of understanding and the evidence base. We will also now consider flexible working options in recruiting for any positions at manager levels and above. It's always been a big bugbear of mine, because getting an excellent or a really good person for 3 or 4 days a week is always way better than an average or a competent person for 5 days. I've always believed that. So if you can find the best person, that's what can really drive new ideas, drive change, drive delivery. And so we've started to build that flexibility into our recruitment of senior positions. Funnily enough, we've also kind of looked at the barriers to men in terms of availing availing of kind of more part-time working options and taking kind of parental leave and things like that, because that is fundamentally a barrier. Because if they all stay in post, and there's a tendency for a lot of our female staff to kind of take those options, that kind of creates a natural imbalance there. So we've been trying to incentivize men to look at those flexible options as well. And I suppose one thing that we've really been able to move forward on, and I think it's one of the few advantages of this crazy kind of COVID situation that we've found ourselves in, is the kind of the flexible working that has necessitated and facilitated has actually proven to be a great leveler, I think. So we're actually finding more women, and this is only anecdotal, but it's certainly my impression, more women across the organisation stepping up and volunteering to get involved in cross-team working and new and exciting projects, maybe even going for kind of new roles as well, because they don't feel anymore that I have to be available from 9 to 5 every minute of the day. That I can actually work around that and do what has to be done in a way that fits in with my other kind of obligations. So that's had a massive impact on SOLAS culture, I believe. And also we've also tried alongside that to introduce something we call cross-SOLAS kind of strategic innovation networks. And that's to expose people at different grades across different teams to cross-team working, to developing ideas and developing initiatives. And while that isn't a gender-specific thing, it really has been important for empowering people at all levels across the organisation and making everyone a bit more visible. And that really has had a tangible effect. So I think we actually have a major opportunity now to embed a kind of fundamental lasting change to eat into the gender pay gap.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. It's very instructive to hear direct experience from within one organisation, and most interesting from a public sector body too. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask now for Sonja to speak with us, Sonja Thorbergsdottir from Iceland, and we're again really grateful to have the Icelandic perspective on this, since Iceland has led the way in terms of tackling gender pay gap. So Sonja, the floor is yours now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and take part in this discussion. It's always good to change learning experiences. First of all, I know that I have a short amount of time, but I really want to give you kind of the short historical background before I go into maybe a few examples of legislation that has worked and maybe some that has not. But I think the key words that kind of emphasize us as a country is collaboration and the mobilization. So we stand on the shoulders of very strong women's rights movements, as you do as well, and labor unions. But I think the turning point in the battle for women's rights was in 1975, when it's estimated that 90% of Icelandic women went on a strike to demonstrate the indispensable work of women for Iceland's economy and society, and also to protest the wage or the pay gap and unfair employment practices. And our first female president, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, who was also first in the world to be democratically elected as a president, she has said that this moment, the women's strike, made the way for her to make it possible to be president. A few years later, the Women's List, also called a feminist political party, was established. And they were active from 1983 to 1999. And that is also a turning point in getting the voice of women in different circumstances where they can partake in the discussion and take the meaningful decisions. We have been on a strike 5 times since 1975. It's not an annual thing, but we usually get a lot of questions each year if we're not going to strike again. Empowering women in the different spheres of life, and they take the discussion home to their workplace or to their friends and etc. And you just carry around the message. That being said, I know that Iceland has been on the top of a lot of lists about gender equality for some years. But generally speaking, we are battling the same problems as most of the European countries are. We're on the top of the list because we had the female president and also 2 female prime ministers. That is one of the main reasons. We still have an average pay gap of 25%, the difference between women and men. And because we're also discussing here the complex factors that are feeding into the gender pay gap, the reason that we usually within the unions and the women's rights movement, we're not looking into the numbers of the explained or the unexplained gender pay gap. We're just talking about the difference of the average of the income, because we know that the pay gap, the reasons behind it are because of that women work, especially part-time work, because of gender segregation in the labor market, because of the difference of power and influence, or just who holds the money, and also, of course, of the work and family life balance. So we think it's not that we should not explain away the differences when the opportunities and the possibilities are not the same. So it's a systematic thing that you have to do to change, to pave the way to reach gender equality. Also, I know that we mainly want to discuss here pay equality, and I want to discuss some or mention some legislations that have well discussed that part. But I want to mention as well that a very decisive moment in our path for gender equality was our decision of maternity and paternity leave. That was set by law in 2000. And from the start, it was decided that fathers should get 3 months that they cannot transfer, and mothers should get 3 months that they cannot transfer. And then they have the mutual of 3 months. And just overnight, it changed the behavior of people. We're going from a country where, as you probably know, fathers were not that involved or had the. After that, they are taking their 3 months, and now actually there's a discussion in Parliament about prolonging it from 9. Well, it's been 10 months this year and to 12 months next year, and we want to keep on to have this sharp division that the fathers can and must take the 6 months, and the mothers must take their 6 months, and they can only transfer 1 month to each other. Because some scholars say this is the Trojan horse into the unpaid work of the homes. It means that the fathers, they own the larger or more share of the responsibility for the child, not only in these first few months, but for longer than that. One other big change was also universal access to childcare or kindergartens, which we have had since 1990. Now it's customary that children get into kindergarten at 2 years old, but we still have a gap because the maternity and the paternity leave will next year be 12 months, but it's usually the mothers that carry the burden of the workload or seeing over their children until they then get into kindergarten. So that is a problem that we are trying to work on these days and years. A thing that didn't work exactly was we changed the Equal Rights Act, our legislation in 2008, and we banned pay secrecy. So we have a law article that states that anyone can tell their pay or wages to whomever they want to, and the employer cannot ban it. But it didn't work. So also what we kind of found out in our research is that this, when it gets personal, people are kind of afraid to talk about it. So you have to change the culture around it in order for something like this to work. We've had gender quotas on boards and corporates and pension funds since 2013. And what we learned from that is maybe we have to implement some penalties because we have not reached our goal of 40 or to 60. And also there's no spillover effect like we hoped for when the legislation was set. We also have now a part of our legislation that every employer that has more than 25 employees has to get an equal pay certification. This is based on an equal pay standard, which was developed by the social partners and also members of the government. So it's a unique thing. It's the only one in the world. And it aims to enforce the current legislation that bans discriminatory practices based on gender when it comes to payments. It's kind of a set of rules that adds to then the legislation that we have now. And the first thing that employers have to do is to analyze the wages, and then they have to make kind of a pay system to fit it in. Just as a closing remark, I want to mention also to the point of the collaboration of different actors that I was a part of a governmental appointed committee called a special task force on equal pay, where the social partners and members of the, or representatives of the government also took place. And the first thing that we did was a wage analysis of the whole labor market. And also we followed through this equal pay standard and then later on the certification. And then we did a large research on the reasons behind the gender pay gap, just to kind of show all the complex factors that are feeding into it. And then, of course, when you have mapped it out, you have to find out how you're going to prioritize your actions. I think I'm well over my time, so I'm going to say thank you for now.
Thank you very much for that, Sonja. Most helpful to hear from Iceland and to hear what did and didn't work, and also, of course, to hear about the multiple factors that contribute to gender inequality, not just the pay gap, but issues around childcare, maternity leave. That's very helpful to hear. Our final panelist will be Emma Kerins from Chambers Ireland, who's going to give us the business perspective. So, Emma, I'll invite you now to speak for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator, and delighted to be here. This has been an area that I've been working in for quite some time, even beyond my time in Chambers Ireland. My background many moons ago was in human rights law, and that's what brought me to New Zealand and working in that particular space. So I'm going to cover a few different points just to kind of share some experience and some of the feedback we get from the business community on this particular issue. So firstly, I'll tell you a little bit about Chambers Ireland and our work, particularly on gender equality and the SDGs. A little bit of the feedback we've been getting over the past couple of years on the drafting of the gender pay gap reporting legislation, and then just where we think we can make it even better so that it actually helps us resolve the gender pay gap and narrow that gap. So Chambers Ireland, we're a very, very large business organisation, largest in the country. We represent 40 chambers in all different parts of the island, and we're cross-border as well. It's cross-sector, businesses of all shapes and sizes, but much like the business community in Ireland, it's mostly SMEs. We, for the past several years, with one of our international partners, the International Chambers of Commerce, have been looking at how can the private sector engage with the Sustainable Development Goals. Off the back of that, both ourselves in Chambers Ireland and our network of 40 chambers, we pledged that the SDGs is something we want to play a role in implementing over the next decade. We picked 5 of those goals strategically, and as head of policy here, I'm delighted to kind of show that why we picked these particular 5, one of which is gender equality. The others make sense in their sustainable cities and communities, decent work, innovation and climate action. But gender equality in particular is very important to the Chamber network, and I'll explain why. So several years ago, one particular issue kind of arose from our membership, and that was around we're having tremendous difficulty retaining women in the workplace. From a skills level, particularly once you're outside of the cities, it's harder to attract talent. They were hemorrhaging talent, particularly middle management level. Childcare was so expensive. What can we do about childcare as an issue? That led us to research the issue, to work collaboratively with some of our partner organisations and look at what needs to be done. And kind of Sonja mentioned it in Iceland as well, like affordable, quality, invested childcare would be the solution to that. So off the back of that, we have looked at childcare and state investment in that, as well as flexible working are 2 issues which we are big champions of. On gender pay gap, particularly, it's been well flagged by all of the speakers in the panel so far that it's complex, that it's not as simple as if you have it in your company, you're doing something to slight the women that work for you. So with the legislation, from a business perspective, we always look at, what is it doing? What is it and what would we like it to do? So what is it? It's a way of measuring. That in itself is something we very much welcome. By measuring something, by recording it, it's an opportunity to self-reflect. It helps you target your action. By publishing that data, it holds you to account. Since this conversation has been started by Senator Bacik as well, a lot of companies have, as well, particularly companies who have operations in the UK, have started publishing their own data. And they're learning a lot about that. I think on Post, they're one of our members, and obviously they're semi-state. They published their own gender pay gap voluntarily, their report last year. And it helps you understand what's going on in your company and what you can do about it. That in itself is very, very valuable. And businesses are certainly, from that experience, seeing that there's an opportunity to understand the culture more and what they can do about that to make sure that they're retaining skills and talent and that they're a more equal place to work. From a legislative perspective then, as a business rep, we always kind of go back and forth in the how and the what it'll look like and when it'll come into effect. One of my big kind of passions from a regulatory legislative perspective, which must sound very nerdy, is something should be SME friendly from the beginning. So with some of the feedback we were getting on the legislation in its initial stages was, is 50 too small? Is the legislation too burdensome? Not every organisation will have kind of an accounting team to help them understand how to record this properly. Is the legislation maybe working for bigger companies, but maybe hasn't actually been kind of revised or simplified in a way that a company of any size could deal with that? So that would be something, while feedback at this point, as the legislation is still advancing through our own parliament here, we'd love to see that it would just be a bit more SME friendly, and particularly since it's targeting companies as small as 50. The second part of that is, so we record the information and what do we do with it? A report doesn't narrow the gender pay gap on its own. Having a gender pay gap doesn't necessarily, like the society has a gender pay gap, necessarily mean that you have done something wrong internally, but it does mean you can do something else to narrow that. So the action plan piece is important. Now, one thing I would say on the action plan piece for companies and narrowing the gender pay gap, a lot of businesses, particularly smaller businesses, will need help doing that. And that feeds into, this is the solution series. How are we going to support business to kind of work as a collaborative partner in society to narrow the gender pay gap? And resources will be needed, whether it's through state agencies or state bodies, to support business to firstly understand when your numbers come back and it says you have a pay gap, what does that mean? And what are the types of things you can do to narrow that? So support in that is very important. I might just leave them with a few kind of parting comments, just in terms of the COVID impact on gender equality and maybe some concerns I might have in terms of how that might contribute over the years to come on the gender pay gap. So first of all, while COVID-19 has transformed the workplace in terms of remote working and flexible working, and that is incredible. Some of the Oireachtas Library and Research, they published a note back in May, and some of the findings they had is that all of the caring responsibilities are still falling on women. So even when they are working in the home, and this is feedback we're getting back from a lot of members, businesses of all sizes, is that those caring responsibilities aren't being evenly carried. So that as time goes on and COVID-19 isn't going anywhere, that more women may either take a step back from the workplace, particularly in terms of managing childcare, and that may kind of trigger a wider pay gap going forward. There's international data that shows female-led businesses maybe have been more likely to close or shush during COVID-19 than others. And further than just in terms of part-time workers in the economy, a lot of part-time workers were more likely to have lost their jobs than full-time workers in some of the restrictions, and are possibly less likely to get those jobs back. More than 70% of part-time workers are women. Andrew, I'm giving a nod to your own data here as well, but that is also something that we're quite conscious of in terms of participation rates and just broader gender equality going forward. I'm happy to share any of these links afterwards, but from our perspective, look, gender pay gap reporting helps companies target the actions. From a legislative perspective, let's make the reporting as SME friendly as possible, and let's make sure we're adding state resources to support business to narrow that gap, target the actions, and actually help make society more equal, more broadly. That's it for me. I think I'm just 5 minutes bang on there.
You are, Emma. Thank you so much for keeping to time. That's super efficient, and thank you for giving us that perspective. And I should say that in our Labour bill, as you say, we had proposed that companies with 50 or more employees would have the obligation to report. Now, that was very different to the British requirement, which, as you heard from Laura, was 250. We were, of course, very much open to have the legislation amended, and indeed there were various proposals for change as it went through, and the government's proposal was to start with 250 and to then incrementally move down to I think to 100. So we'll see, but that was the previous government. So unfortunately, we're still at a sort of stagnant phase. Now we have a few questions in, and I just want to come to Laura first to ask you, Laura, what you've given us a great overview of the British experience. Is it too early to say what the outcomes are, and is there any proposal to extend the reach of the organisations? We've just heard from Emma about the concerns about SMEs, that if you start too small, it's too onerous and you mightn't have the high rates of compliance. In Britain, clearly, the alternative view, they started with this limit of 250, so only companies employing more than 250 are covered. But is there a proposal to expand that to smaller companies? And then also this issue about outcomes, which is always asked. People always ask, well, what's the effect of the legislation been? So Laura.
Yeah, so I guess starting first with the question of the SMEs, the Government Equalities Office are kind of keeping quite tight-lipped on what they see as the future of the British legislation. I think because everything has been kind of thrown up into relief by coronavirus. So I know that they're looking at it, but I'm not sure what their thinking is there. But I do know when we look at other places, there is the possibility of taking a staged approach. So some countries will say, if 250 employees, this is what you need to produce. And if you have 100, this is what you need to produce, and 50 and so on. And so you can take a staged approach. In terms of the outcomes, look, I think a lot of this legislation is really new, so it is quite hard to see what are the impacts. And when we were looking across the board, we kind of looked for evaluations, and we found there aren't too many that are out there so far. But what we can look at is things like compliance, and is it kind of functioning? Are people responding to the law, and are they doing what they kind of need to do? And I think here, the UK example is quite instructive, because they did a lot of work with businesses before the legislation was introduced, building capacity around the data side of things and helping them to understand their obligations. And then the second part of the puzzle, which Emma gestured to, is that they then put a lot of effort into building a research program around helping producing kind of what works materials. So business-friendly material that they could share that was evidence-based, that was kind of drawn on the best possible evidence to say, okay, well, this is what you can do, and also this is what you should be doing beyond what we've asked you to do. Exactly the kind of stuff that Andrew has talked us through, drilling down into your data in a more granular way, because and focusing on what are those pinch points, what is your particular data telling you what you need to do. So I think those are the kind of key things that I think we would learn, and kind of what is the best kind of process going forward.
Thanks very much, Laura. That's really helpful to hear. And since you referenced Andrew, there was a question in specifically for you, Andrew, so I'll go to you next. How do you incentivize men to take up the flexible work options? It's again a question we hear a lot when we're debating these issues. What's your experience been in SOLAS of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we only had 5 minutes, so we didn't cram everything that we've been doing into it. But the importance of mentoring and role models in terms of showing our female staff that there is a career pathway in SOLAS has been really important. But also, and maybe we just got a little bit lucky with this, it was also important in us trying to persuade some of our male staff that actually, taking a career break or taking reduced hours in order to, look after the kids, or, even to do other stuff that you're interested in, is a perfectly valid choice. And we had one of our senior managers actually decide to do that. And he's a great speaker. And so we actually used him time and time again in staff events and promoting the schemes and the flexible working arrangements that were available to talk about his experience and talk about what it had given him. So that sense of kind of finding a role model to spread the message was really important. And also going back to the COVID theme, and I totally take Emma's point about the research and how the burden of caring seems to be falling more on females than males. I also think in some kind of households, COVID's been a great leveler. You're both stuck in the house, you're both having to juggle your work responsibilities with finding a way to bring up your families. And from a SOLAS perspective, we are seeing that take effect, that we have a number of directors, number of managers who've taken extended periods of leave off to look after the kids or have reduced their working hours, to balance their family responsibilities. A lot of men in that space as well. So I do think it's kind of taught a lot of us to understand the work pressures that are on our partners as well, and to think in more kind of equal terms about how we deal with that collectively. So we are seeing it. Maybe we just got lucky because of the time and because we had Justin who was willing to kind of sell the message, but it has been effective, and we are seeing more and more think about that decision.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I think you've illustrated very clearly there the importance of leadership and role models, and to have men who are willing to take leadership on this as well. I think that's crucially important, that it's not just women. Again, over the years, speaking about the gender pay gap legislation, I think that's come across so strongly from so many organisations. Another question has come in, and thanks to all of you who are putting in points and links and so on the chat. It's very lively. Another question that's come in that I might ask you, Sonja, given you have a more international perspective, how many years will it take to close the gender pay gap? It's the key, again, a key question. I've seen various different assessments. What's your thinking on that? In other words, if we do nothing, will it close automatically, or does it have to take positive?
I know that, you can feel different oppositions of this, that some people say, oh, it's changing. 2/3 of university students, like in Iceland, are women, and etc. But I think all our research on the progress that you made is due to action. So that's usually kind of the mantra that I maintain everywhere I can go, is actions, actions, actions. And I was discussing the different complex factors that feed into the gender pay gap. And Nordic scholars, they have kind of said in their latest research that we have stagnated. So they are saying we need more actions as well. So it's not just a personal opinion here. I just wanted to address our experience, because we've had some research on the division of the unpaid labor now in the times of COVID, and we're seeing kind of the same development as usual. It's more women that are taking more responsibility of the workload. So there is a real danger here during COVID times that we will be taking steps backwards when it comes to gender equality. So, I mean, if any time is important, I think it should be especially now, because many people are discussing how are we going to be after COVID. And that's when you kind of push forwards the ideas and then get the change of how we're going to approach the system.
Okay, thank you for that, Sonja. And that is important, that while the effects of COVID and working from home can be levelling, there is this real concern that it has had a gendered effect and is disadvantaging women more. And I've seen it in academic settings as much as anywhere else. Could I ask, before we go to Michelle, to give us a final wrap up, which and that's a challenge, Michelle, given how much information we've heard over the course of this hour. I'm just going to ask Emma perhaps to answer one final point. And again, from the business perspective, we've heard just now from Sonja speaking about the importance of taking action to address the gender pay gap, that otherwise it's stagnant. You know, what's the perspective from business as to the most important action that could be taken to bring business with us, so we don't necessarily have a women's strike here as we had in Iceland? I know many of us are very excited about that prospect, but clearly, you know, there's been an approach taken to try and work with employers on this. So what's the key thing to bring employers?
So the key thing is, I think reporting shouldn't be in a vacuum. So it should be one piece in tandem with several others. There's lots of pieces of government working on at the moment that could support a narrower gender pay gap and support participation. Remote working strategy is one of those, a better framework for flexible working in the workplace and supporting employers to do that. So I think not in a vacuum. And second point being is, like, get the message clear that this is a diagnostic tool. It's not a naming and shaming. It's not about damaging businesses' reputation. The gender pay gap exists. We're trying to narrow it, and the government plays a role in supporting businesses to do that, so that we actually, as a society and as a nation, narrow it collectively. So I think resources and supports are very, very important, and making it clear that this is diagnostic and not an end in of itself.
Thanks very much for that, Emma. That's a good positive one to finish on. And I note that there's a lot of feedback coming in about the Icelandic women's strike and the difference it made, but that it wasn't seen as being anti-business or anti-employer, and that's a very important point, I think, as well. And I should say, just to put one final point in for myself, that certainly incentives should be, we've always thought should be built into this, that there are some jurisdictions, Australia being one, where employers who do well on the data are rewarded, that there's incentives to do this. Within academia, we have the Athena Swan Awards. Andrew will be well aware, you know, the universities compete to show how good our practices are for promotion of gender equality in the workplace, including pay equality. So these are incentives, I think, that are, as you say, not about blaming, but about giving credit for good practice. So could I now invite the rapporteur, Professor Michelle Miller, to give perhaps, if you will, Michelle, just a short reaction to the discussion, to the great amount of information we've heard and the wonderful papers that are presentations that we've been listening to. What's your initial reaction as somebody who's been so closely connected with working with Work Equal and has and wrote the report from the conference last year?
Thanks, Senator, and thanks everybody. Once again, fantastic contributors again today here, and great to listen to. I think really for me, it was great to hear Laura in terms of what we can learn from other countries, which is something that, you know, we did mention a lot last year, to look at what works in other countries. And I suppose for me, the real take home piece as well was around transparency and the importance of transparency. Measuring with that, as you say, you know, that we work with organisations. I think I like the piece around France as well, in terms of where things aren't working, that the employers, the employees and the trade unions look and say, right, what can we do? Which leads me on really to Andrew, because I think he was very, very good to share with us the reflections in his own organisation. And I think while there'll be some things that are similar for a lot of organisations, every organisation has its own unique, distinctive culture and habitat, and that really we need to look under the hood of what's going on within our own organisations. So that was really refreshing to hear in that, and really how very often for organisations that we think if that at the senior level we've got a good gender balance, well then, you know, that's how it works, or that everything else is okay in the organisation, where it's very often at the middle and the lower levels again, which links on to what Sonja was saying in terms of how even in Iceland, because you've prominent females in political positions, it can look to the outside that you've got equality there. But for me, that really important piece that Sonja spoke about, which I would be a big believer of in terms of policy and legislation, how impactful the changes to the maternity leave could be. You know, when government mandates the sharing of parental responsibility, that can have an impact. And again, the quality mark for organisations, which we spoke about last year. And then finally with Emma, I think, you know, it was fantastic to hear how important gender equality is to the chambers, but also, you know, being very solution focused in terms of this is going to be a change and a shift for organisations, and organisations will need support in terms of how they deal with the findings and how they report in the findings, but that yes, that this is something that shouldn't be a naming or shaming. So it was great. We had a little bit more mention of COVID today as well and the negative impact. So we didn't manage to escape COVID for an hour, unfortunately, but it is clearly something that is having an impact on women and families in terms of trying to juggle work and caring, and whether that really has resulted, as we know, even in the study that we did in the Whitaker Institute in NUI Galway, that the caring is not being shared in the home. So thank you very much, Senator.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And I'm sorry I neglected to introduce you properly. Professor Michelle Miller, of course, is Dean of Students at NUI Galway, a member of the University Management Team. But crucially for today, she's Academic Advisor to the Work Equal campaign. And as I said, co-authored last year's report. Michelle, just in 1 minute before we close, could I ask you, just you know, reflecting on what we've heard today and on the conference last year, given that this is very much a solutions-focused event, as all Sonja Lennon's projects are, you know, what do you think is the key next step for us in the Oireachtas? And I would like just again to extend a welcome to all the Oireachtas members who joined us today. It's great to see so many colleagues online in this workshop. What's our next step? As mostly, I think, women, all I'm seeing are women, fellow women Oireachtas members. What's our next step on a cross-party basis in the Oireachtas, do you think?
I think the next step really is to look at the legislation as is and move either to amend in terms of the lessons that we've learned, because there has been a lot of lesson learning in terms of other countries, see how it still fits, negotiate with the stakeholders, and let's get it moving. That's really the next step, Senator.
Thanks very much. Well, that's again a positive note to finish. In spite of the negativities of COVID, we'll remember those key words. We'll think of the Icelandic women's strike as our inspiration, and I think we will. I know we will all continue to work together to try and make progress on this, so that it doesn't take. I think some of the assessments are 99 or 100 years before we see pay parity. So I'd just like to thank all our panelists once again, to thank all the Work Equal team, and most importantly, all of you for attending. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for allowing us to trend on Twitter and on social media. Do keep up the social media, and thank you for using the chat function. And of course, this is only the second in a series of 5 free panel discussions Work Equal are organising. The next one will be on Thursday, 12th November. That's this Thursday. What role is flexible working in achieving gender equality? An issue we really heard a good bit about today, particularly from Andrew with the SOLAS experience. So the other 2, there are going to be 2 others after that on sequential Thursday lunchtimes, focusing on caring duties in women in leadership. Excellent guest speakers lined up for each event. So register and find out more at workequal.ie. A huge thanks to the campaign sponsors, SOLAS and Permanent TSB. And again, finally, huge thanks to all of you for taking part and for making this such a lively event. I've learned so much myself. Sonja, do you want to say a final word? Sonja Lennon.
Thanks, Ivana. You've said it all. Gold standard MC, fantastic panel, really enjoyed it, and here's to the next one.
Hear, hear. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thanks, Ivana.
Thank
you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.